Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Nehemiah chapters 7 through 13 in our continuing study of the historical books of the Old Testament. We saw last time, the last two sessions, the rebuilding of the walls. Nehemiah had first talked to God and to the king about his plan. He was given permission and put it in writing. He returns back to Jerusalem. They do the work. He shares with them the plan. He sells them on the plan. They start the work. There's opposition, but they continue throughout. And finally, at the end of chapter 6, the job is done. Now we come to the second half of the book of Nehemiah. It's going to be about reviving the people. And we start off with a numbering of the people. And it's not just, one number. You actually have their names. So we start off chapter 7, verse 1. Now, when the wall was rebuilt, and I had set up the doors, and the gatekeepers, and the singers, and the Levites were appointed, then I put Hanani, my brother, we saw him at the very first part of the book, and Hananiah, the commander of the fortress. I know their names sound alike, but they're two different people. And he was in charge of Jerusalem, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. So notice they're men of both ability, but also of faithfulness. Verse 3, then I said to them, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot. In other words, until not right when the sun first starts to come up, but when it's been up a bit. And while they are standing guard, so the point is we're going to keep Jerusalem safe day and night. Let them shut and bolt, and while they're standing guard, let them shut and bolt the doors. So they're going to let people through at a time, but they're going to always be ready to have the gate shut. Also appoint guards from the inhabitants of Jerusalem, each at his post, and each in front of his house. Remember how they had taken ownership at the time of the building, but the hostility is still out there. There are still those that want to see Jerusalem fall, and even though the wall's been rebuilt, it could still be attacked. Verse 4, now the city was large and spacious, the Hebrew term here, Rak Evat Yomim Ugdola, literally wide of hands. That's those first two terms, and then gadol is just and great. But large and spacious works. I think that's really the idea behind it. In other words, it's a big city. They've built the walls, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not built. So it's not very populated, and it's not able to get very populated for right away because it doesn't have a lot of housing. The walls are up, but it's more or less a little bit of an empty city. And so what we're going to have here, chapter 7, we had the gatekeepers, the singer, the Levites were appointed. We have now from verses 5 through 60. That's a long section. We're not going to read that, but that's a listing of the people. Next, we have the number of those who could not show birth records that they were Israelites, and there were a number of people. Remember, Jerusalem had been destroyed. The records had been destroyed. They hadn't necessarily carried file cabinets with them to Mesopotamia. And so they knew from word of mouth that they were Israelites, but they couldn't prove it in writing. Next, there's a total number of the people. So we had a listing of them in verses 5 through 60. Now we're given that total number. And then finally, we're told the priests, the Levites, and the gatekeepers, the singers, lived in their cities, not necessarily in Jerusalem, but in the surrounding areas. Now, that's the number of the people. That's chapter 7. Next, we come to chapters 8 through 12, where we're going to see covenant renewal. And we begin chapter 8, verse 1, and all the people gathered as one man at the square, which is in front of the water gate. Remember that the water gate is near the place where the water is. The place where the water is is the Gihon Spring. So that's on the east side of the city and looks out into the Kidron Valley. They gather here. And by the way, that's the same place where they crowned Solomon as king, probably for the same reason. That's where the water was, but that's also a historic place. That's the place where Jerusalem was first captured. And so they gather here, and they ask Ezra, the scribe, to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. Then Ezra the priest, and notice he was both a scribe, but he's also a priest. He brought the law before the assembly of men, women, and all who could listen with understanding on the first day of the 7th month. This is the the day of the blowing of trumpets. This is they're going to have several feasts, several times of remembrance. First, there's the blowing of trumpets, and then later on, a week and a half later, there's going to be Yom Kippur, and then after that will come what we call the feast, the feast of Sukkot. That is the feast of, sometimes we call it tabernacles, shelters, temporary dwellings. And those things are all getting ready to happen, but right now they're going to hear the word of the Lord read and explained by Ezra, the priest slash scribe. Now, Leviticus chapters 23 and verses 24 and 25 had given them this information about those feasts. That's where they were laid out in Leviticus 23. Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, you shall have a rest, a reminder by blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work, but you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. So they're getting ready for other things to take place too, but it begins at the beginning of the month with this blowing of trumpets. And let me just say, there's more to come. Verse 3, and he read from it, that is from the scriptures, before the square which was in front of the water gate, from early morning until midday. You can read an awful lot of the scriptures in that time, and they do. Notice, in the presence of men and women, those who could understand, and all the people were attentive to the book of the law. Not everyone could read. Just in the ancient world, the literary rate of the general population was abysmally low. Most people could not read or write. Usually just scribes. Among the Jewish people, eventually you're going to see a higher literacy rate than almost any other culture in the ancient world, because these people were what we call people of the book. They had these holy scriptures. But right now they're hearing it, they're listening, and they're taking it in. Verse 5, and Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was standing above all the people, and when he opened it, all the people stood up. Think about this. Everyone's sitting, and then he opens the book, and out of respect, they all stand up. Then Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people answered Amen and Amen while lifting up their hands, and then they bowed low and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. So there's a movement, the movement of worship that's taking place here. Verse 8, and they read from the book, from the law of God, translating to give the sense so that they understood the reading. Now, I don't think that they're translating in the sense that they're having to go to a different language. I don't think. Yes, there was a common language among a lot of the people in the Middle East, the language of Aramaic, and it's a bit like Hebrew. It's a lot like Hebrew, but there are some differences too. But I don't think that's what's happening here. I don't think they're necessarily resorting to Aramaic. When it talks about translating to give the sense, in other words, it's explaining the meaning. So here is Ezra, who is reading, but also giving commentary at the same time. And they found written in the law how the Lord had commanded through Moses that the sons of Israel should live in booths during the feast of the 7th month. We already talked about that. That's coming up. They're not there yet. They started at the 1st of the month, but that's going to happen later on in the month. They're going to live in booths. So they proclaimed and circulated a proclamation in all their cities and in Jerusalem, saying, go out to the hills and bring olive branches and wild olive branches, myrtle branches, palm branches, branches of other leafy trees, to make booths, as it is written. Notice, we call it sometimes the Feast of Tabernacles, but a tabernacle sounds more like a tent. This was booths, and they're obeying the letter of the law. So the people went out and brought them and made booths for themselves, each on his roof. So notice what's happening. These are people that are living in the city, but instead of living in their house for that week, they're going to go up on the roof. That's one of the places they might have available. Now, their roofs aren't sloping. If I went up to my roof, I might roll off because I've got a sloped roof. I live in South Florida. But back then, and in Israel, where they didn't have all that much rainfall, the roof was usually a flat roof, and so they could go up there, and you might go up there in the evening just to cool off, if it's in the summer. But here they're going to actually make these shelters on their roofs. That's the flat space. And they're going to live not in the house, but over the house or around the house. Notice each on his roof, in their courts, and in the courts of the house of God, and in the square at the water gate, and in the square at the gate of Ephraim. Even if you don't have a house in Jerusalem, and remember, they didn't have many houses in Jerusalem. We already saw that. The people are going to gather there, and they will be camping out for the entire week. And that's going to start a regular practice. It should have been a practice all along, but they had gotten away from that, and now they're reminded, and they're going to start this as a regular practice, living in temporary shelters, to remind them that there's a time back in the past that they lived in temporary shelters, but also there's a time in the future where God is going to take up his tabernacle with them. And of course, we see the application of that in Jesus, who, according to John chapter 1, verse 14, the word was made flesh, and literally, and tabernacled among us. That same idea here. Verse 17, and the entire assembly of those who had returned from the captivity made booths and lived in them. The sons of Israel had indeed not done so from the days of Joshua, the son of Nun, to that day. They'd really forgotten this, and there was great rejoicing. So we have the Feast of Tabernacles observed in chapter 8. Now in chapter 9, there's going to be a prayer of national confession. They're going to pray, and they're going to confess their sins. So chapter 9, verse 1, on the 24th day of this month, the sons of Israel assembled with fasting in sackcloth with dirt upon them. Now we're past the point of tabernacles. That was great. Verse 2, the descendants of Israel separated themselves from all foreigners and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. Verse 3, while they stood in their place, they read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for a fourth of the day. And for another fourth, they confessed and worshiped the Lord their God. So notice there's reading and there's the prayer of confession, but there's also worship. And it's all taking place throughout this period. So we had the Feast of Tabernacles. Now we've got a prayer of national confession. That's chapter 9. We're going to see chapter 10 where the covenant is signed, and chapters 11 through 12 will be a listing of the people. So chapter 11, now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9/10 remained in the other cities. They're trying to repopulate Jerusalem, and notice they cast lots. Verse 2, and the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem, because let me just say, living in Jerusalem at this point in history was not necessarily a comfortable thing. Why? No houses. Remember we said that. And Jerusalem, this is the center of hostility, and you can get attacked in Jerusalem. And so you're sort of putting yourself out on the front lines by going to Jerusalem. Let me just say, today, if you're a Christian, it's coming to the point where you're sort of on the front lines. It's not necessarily comfortable. It has been for a long time, especially in my own country. But it's becoming increasingly unpopular, and maybe sometimes you're even putting a target on yourself. And I'm thinking about some things that have happened just recently in the news about people putting a target on themselves when you speak out for Christ, and that's what was happening here. We come to chapter 12, verse 27, and now we're going to see the dedication of the wall. We have the wall built, and we read about how one choir went to the south with Ezra to there's no plus way to say this, to the dung gate. That's the gate on the south end of Jerusalem. It's I guess, where you flush everything. Remember that the pool of Siloam gathers out there, and there's a water tunnel that takes the water to the south end, and I guess that water is used for flushing, and it takes all the garbage outside of the gate. And then the other choir goes north with Nehemiah to the sheep gate. That's on the north side of the city, or at least to the north. And what they're going to do is they're both going to join in the temple. They'll make a circuit, I suppose, of the walls, and then they'll join in the temple to worship and to sing. That's in verse 40. So we have the covenant renewal ceremony, numbering of the people, covenant renewal, and finally, chapter 13, we're going to see some further reforms. There's still a few issues that remain. Chapter 13, verse 1, on that day, they read aloud from the book of Moses. Do you notice the theme here? They've been reading a lot of scriptures. That's good. In the hearing of the peoples, and there was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. They've forgotten the things that are in here. They're reading, they're catching up, and they're seeing this about Ammon and Moab. Why? Verse 2, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but instead hired Balaam against them. Remember that story that's in the book of Numbers? Hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. That's the story that was told in the book of Numbers. Now remember, there had been some exceptions. There had been Ruth, the woman who left her people to go and be part of the people of God. But still, the people as a people, the Ammonites and Moabites, had really been traditional enemies of Israel, going way, way back, and even close to the present. So they read this in the book of Moses, and it's about the Ammonites and the Moabites, and it was all around that story of Balaam. Verse 3, so when they heard the law, they excluded all foreigners from Israel. They hear the law, they obey the law, no foreigners allowed. This isn't a racist thing. It's a thing that has people that are dedicated to the Lord, with the Lord, and those that aren't, those that are just like, they're sort of hanging on, but they tend to bring their own gods and their own theology and their own religion. There's not going to be any of that allowed. Verse 4, now prior to this, Eliashib, the priest who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah. Remember Tobiah? He was one of the bad guys. He's one of the people that tried to dissuade them from building the walls. He had a vested interest in the people of God failing, because that would cut into his, well, it would cut into his profits. Not that he was a prophet, but it was all about the money. And notice, he had been related to Tobiah, had prepared a large room for him, where formerly they put the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil prescribed for the Levites. And so he's been in a place where he could sort of help himself to the funds and to the supplies of both, notice, the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. Here's a case where this foreigner has been put in a place where he can help himself to the funds that go into the temple. Verse 6, but during all this time I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king, and after some time, however, I asked leave from the king. So he's gone back to Mesopotamia, back to Susa, and then he's gotten permission to come back again. So some time has passed here. Verse 7, and I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. Tobiah doesn't belong in the house of God. Pagans don't belong in places of authority and places of finance. In the temple, let me just say, in the church, you want trustworthy people that are over finances in the church. So chapter 13, verses 1 through 8, we see how they read in the law that the Moabites and Ammonites shouldn't be allowed in the temple. That was verses 1 through 3. And then Eliashib, the priest, had allowed Tobiah to have a chamber in the temple. And Nehemiah had been away from Jerusalem serving Artaxerxes, but now obtains permission to return. And that's going to be the pivotal point in this section. And he comes back and he learns how Eliashib, the priest, had allowed Tobiah to have a chamber in the temple. And now Nehemiah upholds the law. He throws all of Tobiah's possessions out of the temple. He's not all that gentle about it. Yeah, he's out. Tobiah's out, because it wasn't appropriate. Now, chapter 13, verse 1 then, where foreigners are removed from Israel, we saw that. We had Tobiah's special privileges are revoked. Next, in verses 10 through 13, a financial accounting is set in order. Because it was obvious that things were not the way they should be when it came to finances. They had allowed the skunk. Excuse me, I don't mean to insult skunks, but they had allowed Tobiah the crook, the one that was against God's people, to have access to the funds. And so we need to make sure, what's appropriate, who's taking what. Let's get everything in order. Verse 14, there's a prayer interlude, a lot of prayer in Nehemiah. Verses 15 through 22, there's some Sabbath issues. Verses 23 through 28, there's a problem of foreign wives. That's the same problem we saw back in the book of Ezra, where there were those who had taken foreign wives. The problem hasn't gone away, even with Operation Divorce. There's others that have come along in the interim. That was 10 or 15 years ago by now. There's others that have come along and taken foreign wives again. And I mentioned this before, but let me just say it again. If you're a Christian, you're not supposed to marry a non-Christian. And I would say don't even date a non-Christian, because that's dangerous. That's playing with fire. Verse 29, there's another prayer. Verses 30 through 31, we're going to see some final arrangements. And finally, again, we're going to close the latter part of verse 31 with prayer. So let's look at that. We have verses 16 through 17. Also, men of Tyre were living there, who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the sons of Judah. That's okay, but notice, on the Sabbath. Because so there were those that were doing the business of buying and selling, which there's nothing wrong with that, but they weren't supposed to be doing it on the Sabbath, and that because that's when it's available. Notice the Jews were involved in this too, even in Jerusalem. Verse 17, then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? The idea of one day in seven to give it over to the Lord, it had been given as a creation ordinance. Now, you ask, well, wait a minute, don't Christians celebrate the Lord's Day on the first day of the week? Yes. I think they started doing, well, actually, I don't have to think. I can read where they started doing this. Back in Acts chapter 2, when the Holy Spirit showed up on the first day of the week. Actually, it happened even earlier than that, where Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week. But then they met together and the Holy Spirit showed up. And after that, I read a couple of instances in the New Testament where it had become the practice of the early church to meet not on the seventh day, but on the first day of the week. Now, if you want to also keep the Sabbath on Saturday, you go ahead and do that. If you feel that that's something you ought to do, then go for it. In fact, it's very often the practice in my own country to work, for people to have both Saturday and Sunday off work. Not everybody does, but there are those are when a lot of the offices are closed, things like that. And yes, I know that there are certain things where work is a necessity, what we call works of mercy, and hospitals are open on the weekends, and I'm glad they are. I did a whole career with the fire department, and the fire department was open. I mean, it was sort of a skeleton crew. We didn't, the main offices weren't open. We weren't doing regular sorts of administration stuff, but we were on call. We were there in the fire station. Sometimes we would do what I used to call a Sunday routine, sort of kick back and but you had to make sure that the equipment was ready, and we would respond to emergencies. We would save lives and we would save property, and that was all appropriate. But here, notice, what is this evil thing you're doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Verse 23, in those days I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. So Ammon and Moab, those we talked about, people were excluded from that. Ashdod, that was a Philistine city. And again, they're beginning to take foreign wives again. As for their children, half spoke the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. And his own people, notice, is considered not Jewish, but something else. As talks mom, so talks the kids, and that's what's happening here. They're forgetting the language, and if they're forgetting the language, they're forgetting the culture, and if they're forgetting the culture, they're forgetting the Lord, and it's all bad. Verse 28, even one of the sons of Joadiah, or Joiada, I'm sorry, the son of Elishahib, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Remember him? He was the governor of Samaria. So I drove him away from me. He had disqualified himself with this improper marriage. He wasn't raising his house to follow the Lord because he's taken an unbeliever as his wife. So don't do that. Verse 30, thus I purified them from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priests and the Levites. He's still setting in order what remains. Notice it has to be done again and again and again, each in his task. And I arranged for the supply of wood at appointed times and for the first fruits. And the entire book ends right here, latter part of verse 31. Remember me, oh my God, for good. That can be our prayer for ourselves too. That we seek to keep the Christian church Christian, that we seek to keep our families Christian. One of the ways you do that is by not marrying somebody who's an unbeliever, and trust in the Lord for each and every generation. I know my own prayer. My wife and I regularly pray. Yes, for our daughter. And for our grandkids, they're now adults, but we don't stop praying for them just because they're adults. Remember me, oh my God, for good.